Hello all you horror fan loving cosmonauts, as always I am Cosmic and today we're going to be reviewing Distrust, which is a new indie game inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing, which is one of my favourite movies of all time, and it is brought to you by Cheer Dealers and Aloha Premium. Now the game revolves around you taking a group of polar explorers through a series of levels, almost in a very FTL design. You've got to go from one sector to another sector, and you've got to do this while surviving the harsh cold wastes of Antarctica, and on top of that making sure that your people sleep as little as possible, because as soon as they sleep there is a mysterious alien force out to get you. Now I have to say that Distrust piqued my interest very easily because I thought the visual design of the game was absolutely top notch. It has a really nice art style that worked very well. That certainly piqued my interest, and as soon as the Thing was mentioned as inspiration, I was in 100%. Sadly, however, once I was in 100%, I wanted to be out pretty much 75%, because what I found within the game was not terrible, but I would argue very, very disappointing, and I'm going to tell you why. Because the game revolves around almost an FTL-like format, which is fine in principle, but the execution of that does not work in the slightest, because when you say your game is inspired by The Thing, that sets a number of expectations that need to be met. The whole point of The Thing wasn't that it was just set in, a remote place in Antarctica. Right? The whole point of The Thing was that you had this alien that could change himself into any one of the expedition, and so you didn't know who was human and who was alien, and there was a psychological element to that. There was a horror element to that. They were actively trying to fight back against this alien force, as well as stay sane for the most part. And Distrust does none of that. It doesn't have any of those elements in there. Basically, it is inspired by The Thing in that there's an alien force and it's set in Antarctica, and that's about it. And they tried to have this psychological element by, not being able to sleep, but that doesn't really work all that well. And so the way that Distrust works is that you go from region to region. In each region, you have to survive by scavenging for various items, such as bandages if you cut yourself, such as tools, so you're able to unlock doors, or dig out snow-covered doors, that kind of thing. You have to scavenge for food, for health items, all that kind of good stuff, and then you have to find a way to unlock the gate to the next sector. Usually that's done by hitting a series of switches in a sequence, and then as you progress it gets more and more difficult to do that, as well as enemies are introduced that will actively try and get you, and you can destroy them by using heat or light. So the premise is fairly simple. The execution of that, though, doesn't really work. While it is a very nice visual experience the entire way through, there is far too much RNG in this to make this enjoyable to the point, especially when you get to later levels. It ends up being a real trial by fire. You end up having to run around looking for a single item that you need, even though you've got a bunch of items. It ends up being that you're having everything is actively working against you to the point where it doesn't become fun. The great thing about games like FTL, and the great thing is games about anything with RNG in it, like Darkest Dungeon, is that you have to combine skill and RNG to be effective, right? So you have to have RNG in there to make unexpected things happen, good or bad. But then you have to have an element of skill in there to make it sure that the entire thing doesn't feel too unfair, right? Whereas Distrust doesn't really do that. Distrust is basically RNG all of the way. What you find, how you find it, what happens when you find it. Eating a meal, for example, you have to roll a die to see what happens if you eat the meal. So you can get food poisoning. Or, if you drink a cup of coffee, you can burn yourself. Or if you open up a container, you can cut your hand. And there's just so much RNG in this that it becomes a really tedious exercise to try and get through it. Then on top of that, there's the disappointment about not really being the thing. I mean, the great thing about what the film and the I think it was the 2006 game The Thing did was that it actively had you trying to manage your psychological stresses of your squad. It had you actively trying to fight back with kick-ass flamethrowers and all that kind of thing against the enemy. And it had this real atmosphere about the entire thing. And Distrust just fails to hold that atmosphere. It fails to really imbue with the sense of the psychological side of what made the thing great. Whereas Distrust doesn't have the psychological side. It just, you have a sanity meter almost. But, that's just based on sleep. And it's really easy to manage that. And you just have to manage those 3 bars at the top. Make sure that they don't get too low. And you'll be absolutely fine the entire way through. And it's just something that it is an exercise in tediousness and frustration for the most part with Distrust. Whereas, any game that is based or inspired by The Thing, it should be more about the psychological stresses of being alone in the Antarctic, facing down the weather and facing down an alien force that can come and kill you at any moment. And it just fails to do that. Distrust just becomes an exercise in repetition for the most part, because you're doing the same thing every single level, which is just scavenge for resources and find a way, find what you need to basically open the gate for the next level. And you're doing that over and over until you finish the game. And that's that. And finishing the game really depends on how well you roll, how well the RNG favors you in that respect in your run. And that's basically it. For me, there's just not enough here to make sure that it makes it as an interesting title. It would have been really nice to have been able to, have more of a psychological element to there, have, hallucinations and crazy stuff happening all of the time, but it doesn't. It just gets a little bit repetitive in that regard. And yes, you can certainly see throughout as you go through the game the elements that are inspired by The Thing, but it doesn't do enough to work that into your own survivors, right? Like, clearly who the enemies are. Even when you come across a guy who changes into a monster, you still know that's an enemy because he's not in your squad. Whereas the great thing about The Thing was that you didn't know if the guy next to you was actually the creature himself. And that's what made The Thing great. And Distrust doesn't have that. And the core gameplay elements and the core gameplay loops of the game really struggle to be interesting after a while. Certainly get frustrating because of the RNG. And I just think it's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but it becomes very, very disappointing. And for, $10, you've got to sit there and think, well, it's not a terrible price to pay if you love RNG based games. Certainly the art style is very nice, certainly the audio is very nice, but does it do anything for you that another game wouldn't do? And I don't think it does. I think that it could have done so much more and had so much more potential and just didn't even come close to reaching that potential, and it sits for me as an overall disappointment. So that is my review of Distrust. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, make sure to subscribe, share the video on social media, and as always, I will see you next time.